The COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on all sectors of society, but perhaps this impact was felt the most in the education sector. With the threat of infection to school children and teachers present, the immediate response of decision makers was to close schools. Dr. Jim Ackers, the Regional Education Advisor of the UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia in Nepal, notes, however, that school closures was not the recommended advice.
Global agencies such as WHO, UNICEF, and the UN bodies as a whole have urged countries to keep schools open and only close them as a last resort and to reopen them as soon as possible. But clearly that message has not really got through to policymakers. Maybe it's also not got through to teachers, and maybe it's also not got through to parents. So there's been a real communication challenge. And maybe again, it does relate to what the resident coordinator just described as the infodemic. There's been a lack of trust in official guidance and scientific guidance around school closures.
In the first 2 years of the pandemic, schools in countries in Latin America and the Middle East in particular have been closed for more than 41 weeks. Countries in South Asia did not fare much better, with schools in Bangladesh closed for 18 months. Initially, some agencies and governments were excited about the possibility of distance learning, considering it a more efficient and up-to-date system. These expectations, however, were short-lived in the face of a growing number of challenges.
And the first one is the very limited access to digital devices, whether that's a computer or whether that's a smartphone, etc. And secondly, actual capacity to use digital devices, inability to shift to digital learning in the case of parents who were supporting children's education at home, and also teachers. And then there's a quality of learning resources. But if you've worked in the development of distance learning materials, you realize it takes a long time to develop high quality programs. And finally, there's the obvious challenge of the cost of devices and the lack of connectivity.
These challenges, however, were experienced differently across the population. In Sri Lanka, for example, students in private schools had greater access to smartphones and computers and received their instructions through these devices. In public schools, where access to digital devices was low, students were taught using a combination of printed packs and textbooks. But recent studies indicate that there is a considerable learning loss associated with distance learning. In rural Karnataka in India, for example, the proportion of children in grade 3 who could read a grade 1 level text fell by 17.6%. Similar patterns of learning loss were seen in rural Pakistan as well. The impact of school closures and distance learning, however, goes beyond learning loss.
So initially, people thought it's quite exciting. Everyone can learn by themselves, no need to go to school, etc. But after a while, we saw that children were really missing school. They were missing it for the social aspect. And then the poorer children were also missing things like school meals, health education, etc. Mental health has been a huge issue. So I think the COVID response in education has got to be a cross-sectoral response.
But what would this cross-sectoral response look like? Firstly, investing in education is crucial. Financing education is important not just for learning recovery. High levels of learning in a society contributes to human capital development and human rights in general. High-income countries invest $8,501 for a child's education. In contrast, low-income countries invest only $48 per child. Therefore, financing of education is a key challenge. Apart from financing, Dr. Ackers suggests that several other measures need to be taken to mitigate learning loss.
You need to package that approach, and part of that packaging is that you have to do the diagnostic assessment to try and find out what has been learned, what hasn't been learned, and then the formative assessment, how each individual child is proceeding. You've got to train the teachers, you've got to get the right materials in place, you've got to adapt the curriculum, etc. So yeah, I think you have to have a sort of a coherent packaged approach to this. And remediation is not something you just do over a few weeks. It may have to actually continue either in parallel. In fact, really, it has to come before you resume the normal curriculum.
Some analysts have suggested that the post-pandemic period presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform education. To do so, several key questions will need to be answered. Firstly, how will people be learning?
Well, I think the first thing to be stated is that children are already learning much more from informal sources like the internet than they are from classrooms. The second thing is that learning will be much more asynchronous. Now, not everybody will be learning together. Most critically, I think we need to have more differentiation in classrooms.
Secondly, what will we be learning?
A lot of people now are saying focus on literacy and numeracy foundational, and I think that's extremely important. But we also need to be looking at employability skills, what was called STEM, 21st century skills, etc. And one of the critical things that we should be doing as teachers is that making sure that children can manage the infodemic, the social media, etc.
The third area that will shape future learning would be in the provision of learning.
Provision of learning are already become quite disparate. Government, private sector was really blooming before COVID. It's retracted a little bit since COVID. And there will be a lot more provision of education as a public good. What I do hope is that it may be that all adolescents can actually access online secondary education at no cost.
Fourthly, how will learning be monitored?
Well, we have to move away from these very slow systems, go much more towards rapid systems which can capture real-time data.
And finally, how can we ensure no child is left behind?
This is going to be the big challenge because education is already transformed for the more elite children going to private schools and international schools, etc. Our challenge will be trying to make sure that all children also get those advantages.